Hello and welcome to Podcrash number 15. Phil isn't here today, but we've replaced him with a man superior in every single way. Mr. Ben Nichols, hello.
Thank you for that introduction, Callum.
It's okay.
Nice to be here.
So Phil's away racing in Valencia, and Ben's come up from Oxfordshire for the day, but he's got a very interesting background. So even though Phil's not here, we thought we'd jump on the chance to sit down with our first non-athlete, actually.
Yeah.
Would you consider yourself a non-athlete?
It's a bit of artistic license for the word athlete. I used to compete as a junior quite highly nationally in tennis and played a lot of sports throughout my life, but I don't see myself as an athlete, no.
Oh, right, okay, fair enough. So Ben actually works in communications, so he's worked in the LTA?
Not the LTA.
ITA?
Actually. No, not the LTA. We'll go around the acronyms.
Yeah, we'll go around the acronyms.
Sport's good for those. So no, I started off my career working so in sports communications and PR, so mainly in tennis. I did my...
I can pick up the introduction from here. So we got the tennis bit sussed, then an F1, then Commonwealth Games Australia,
correct,
then WADA, and now you've started your own business, and your biggest and most valuable client, Callum Skinner, has also put some work your way.
Absolutely. Delighted to work with you, Callum.
So I think the theme for today's podcast is to really see what it's like from the other side. Like, are athletes really a pain in the arse to deal with for the normal world to work with? Are they a delight? Are they not? The issues that sporting organisations face when they've got a bit of controversy coming their way, and also just your take on sport and what sport needs to do to survive, I guess. It's a really competitive landscape out there.
Yeah.
But I guess our first question is, the idea of working in comms for sport is actually quite a new thing. Like, if we look back into the amateurism of Olympic sport, and for what we were talking about Formula 1 earlier, it's really quite a new position. So what do you think you bring to sport? How do you enhance sport in your kind of career, I guess?
Yeah, it's a funny one working in sports PR or communications or whatever you want to call it, really, because not so many years ago, I'd certainly be redundant in this career because it didn't exist as a profession. I think you go back not so many decades and you had athletes on the one hand and you had journalists, and perhaps 60s, 70s onwards you had agents getting more involved, but sports PR professionals is much more kind of new profession. It's a new layer, if you like. I don't think it's always all good. There is a lot of I guess a lot of kind of extra layers that get put into the process by having PR people, a lot of sort of protection, a lot of I guess sort of comfort blankets being put in for athletes, when sometimes from a sports fan point of view you probably just want to hear from the athlete uncensored without the sort of spin doctors involved. But I think that there's a lot of value for people in public relations and communications when they do it well and they do it with the right intentions. So I've always taken the mindset of looking to when I'm working with people to very much have an open approach with media. So how can I promote who I'm working for? How can I get across the best about their character and identity? And character and identity is something I talk about a lot. Yes, there's a certain amount of sort of protecting reputations and sort of defending to be done, but I'm much more I like to look at the kind of the upsides and the opportunities, and like to sort of not put in place too many censors between the journalist and the athlete, because I think people want to hear the authentic voice and personality of those athletes, and not the sort of the manicured approach of PR in between.
So I guess from like a sports fan's perspective, do you feel as if there's still a place for the athlete to be candid, I guess? So Formula 1's a great example. When you see those guys giving interviews in the mix zone afterwards, there's always someone from the team with a dictaphone.
Yeah.
And I guess the presumption is that, well, first of all, why do they have a dictaphone? Are they there just to pick up, to make sure if something's misconstrued in the press, or are they there just to kind of monitor the contracts and see if they bring the team into dispute at any point?
Yeah, I can tell you why, because that was me several years ago. It's very visible in F1 because, like you say, on TV you see the driver there and you see their press officer right by them. They're very much a visible part of the team. Specifically to the dictaphone part, it's a way of recording the driver's quotes, so that when you then go back to the motorhome and you're doing the press release, you haven't got to use your memory to work out what they've said. You've got it there, and you can put that into your messages and your press releases.
But that's the nice side of it. Like, is it ever a kind of damage control element as well?
There probably is an element of that. When I was doing it, I worked in F1 for a year. I was mainly doing it for the practical purpose of going to have to write several hundred words on the team performance and what the driver said. But no, I think there is an element of, if something gets written which you don't think is fair, or to the other extreme wasn't even said, then you can go back to your recording and say, hang on a minute, this has been totally fabricated. So there is an element of that, and I think that's the PR. The PR practitioners, they're always thinking about what gets said, what gets misconstrued, and how their kind of client is represented. So there's definitely an element.
But you had a pretty tense time because you were working for Romain Grosjean, and when he was in for the Renault team in F1, and round about that time, he was known for causing a few instances. Like I think Sebastian Vettel took a whole bunch of issues with him crashing all the time, and always thought that he was a liability on the track. He's quite often starting from the back or fighting with the stewards. Yeah. So a lot of those kind of points would have been quite tense, I guess.
Yes,
especially when you got Sebastian Vettel giving an interview slagging off Romain Grosjean next to you in the mixed pool, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, my recollection of it, I didn't see that as the kind of forever issue that season. There was a lot of different things going on, and I think generally the F1 paddock is quite high octane as it is. There's a lot of strong nice pun. There you go. I'm always one for a pun. There's a lot of strong personalities. A lot of people who are. You put those drivers together. You put the team mechanics together. You put the PR people together. You put the commercial heads, the agents together in a very high octane, high adrenaline atmosphere where people are lacking sleep. They're in town for a couple of days. It's like a road show. There's a lot of I guess tempers fraying, and generally, I think yes, it's a lot of competition in that sport. It's very competitive. You see the competitiveness between the drivers, and I think that comes across on TV. And yes, in the paddock, you see that as well. And there's all these storylines and dramas and things. I think as a press officer or someone working in the the PR or commercial side of the team, a lot of that is background noise. And yes, sometimes you'll have to clarify things or put across your position from the team, but a lot of that is people creating stories out of what's often nothing.
Do you ever have you ever been dealt with an athlete that's gone totally off piste? So we always used to wind up your equivalent in British cycling and saying, at the next interview I'm going to say Lance Armstrong is my hero. Deal with it. I mean, we never would, but it was just to wind them up a little bit and get them on edge. But do you, first of all, is there like a bit of tension between you, thinking, oh my God, what's this loose cannon going to say? And if they did ever go off and won, like, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, do you know what? I'm casting my mind back, and I can't recollect. It will probably come to me after we're off air. I can't recollect any time when I've really thought, oh God, they've put their foot in it. I'm really going to have to scurry around and try and think about how we deal with this. That said, I have seen it often happen elsewhere, and I think if we went back to a different era when there perhaps weren't so many PR people involved, and actually there was an era where athletes were perhaps more outspoken and more maybe themselves, and less worried about how things are construed in the media, or less worried about what can be said on Twitter about them and so forth. They're perhaps a bit more free speaking, and they did say these things. But then again, you go back to an era 30, 40 years ago. The things we might consider controversial now might not have been then. They were just personalities or characters. So, there is an argument for, have many athletes become a bit kind of, had their personalities sanitized because they're worried about how things will be portrayed. And is that a healthy thing when I think a lot of sports fans do want to see genuine personalities out there?
So in the nicest way possible, in the nicest way possible, you guys are known for like turning a negative into positive. Like there's nothing, like a good PR comms guy, there's nothing they can't spin. Yeah. So I put you in a scenario with a cyclist, which happened a few years ago. So you had Bradley Wiggins at a Skoda event, and they asked Bradley, how's the Skoda? And he went, fuck Skoda. I wouldn't even have my mum drive one of them. How do you manage to save that situation?
I think it's got to be a classic sort of well, Bradley is Bradley.
Yeah.
Boris is Boris.
Or is that just one of those situations where you have to just put your hands up and say, like, there's nothing I can do with this?
Do you know what? I genuinely would go into that and think, what's the big deal? He's expressed a personality, a point of view. We all have points of view. Some of us mute them more than others. Actually, in an age when things are really sanitized and things are so kind of messaged and sort of manicured, why isn't it good for people to be outspoken? Free speech is something we I think should value. there are times and places when you should maybe bite your tongue more than others, but I think by and large go into these situations and think, well, this is a bit of fun. It's created a talking point. Someone else will have another point of view. Let's have a chat about it, because that's actually real life. The more we try and box things in and create dramas or scandals out of things, which in the grand scheme of life are not that big a deal, the more I think we scare people from even airing those points of view. And I think by and large, you've got to kind of open it up and have a bit of a laugh about it.
Okay, so obviously Skoda wouldn't be too happy about that situation.
No, maybe they wouldn't have a laugh about it, but I think...
and you're the kind of middleman, I guess, aren't you? You're trying to construe it to keep everyone appeased and happy, I guess.
I think it's maybe to directly answer your point, maybe in a situation like that, you're trying to give people a sense of perspective. There's no spinning to be done there. He's expressed a view, and I'm sure it's a genuine point of view he had at that moment in time, but you get people to see the other parts of the athlete's personality, and maybe they think, okay, well, it's just one flippant comment.
Well, let's pick on a more marginal point then. So I'm taking it back to tennis as well. We had Andy Murray quite famously said that he wanted anyone else but England to win at the World Cup, and that went ballistic across, and he was portrayed as being anti-English, this dour Scotsman who hated the English, hated this and that. So that was spun one way, but how would you try and, say if you're working for Andy Murray, how would you try and spin it the other way?
A storm in a teacup, to be honest, which again, I imagine if you responded like that, it might fan a few flames, but the reality is, you look at, from what I have seen of Andy over the years and what I know about him, you look at the bigger picture, there's no sort of anti-English there. It's a comment, a bit of a joke. I think people kind of jump onto one particular thing that someone said and trying to extrapolate it into that's their personality or that defines them. And, no, it doesn't. There are plenty of things they'll say which don't get picked up on air, which would kind of totally counteract that. So I think you've got to... you're trying to give people a sense of perspective. And, yes, they can, maybe you're communicating something for the athlete, saying, there was no intention of X or Y, how it's being construed at that moment in time. But let's move on here. Look at all the good things that he's doing, or the other points of view which you do agree with. And I think just try and have a sense of perspective and not get wrapped up in one comment which feeds into this idea that someone's anti something.
And I guess you have to do a bit of kind of building people back up after they have a bad experience like that as well. So he obviously, I think he kind of went a bit more introverted after that, because he was like, this isn't what I think, it's been construed the wrong way, and oh God, how do I get past this? Yeah,
absolutely. I think there is a building up job. I think as much as you say, have a sense of perspective, things stick with people for a while, whether they should or not. So I think there is a sense of building it up and building up that brand and showing all the good sides of the person's personality, and what they do for the sport on the court. Obviously, they let their performances do the talking, but also what they do to kind of better their sport or work with others. Whether it be in charity, whether it be for the good of the game. And you've got to I think show people that bigger picture of who they're about, and then people make their own judgments. And as the years pass, then people will say, okay, they made that comment once, but look at all this other stuff. And people take a bit more of a balanced point of view. So there is a job as a PR person to be done, certainly. Whether you agree with it personally and you think this has been totally overblown, that's your personal views.
So we'll move on to the national governing bodies and WADA you've worked for as well in a second, but I'd quite like to pull your comparisons on the difference between tennis and working in F1 to probably, to put it bluntly, a kind of upper class sport, I guess, like that. So you'd think the similarities would be quite similar, but how did you find the difference working between those two different sports?
They are probably to their various degrees both seen as quite elitist sports. Tennis, I would say, tennis is a travelling circus. It's a tour sport, so people are going from place to place and they're putting on a show and then they're packing up and they're going on to the next. But there is a bit more of a sense. It's not normal life maybe, but it is a bit more of a sense of normality than Formula One, which to me, seen from the outside and when I worked in it, certainly a sport of excess. Seen as a party sport, rightly so. And I think I was involved in an era when the parties weren't quite what they once were, but it was definitely
I'm not sure if the parties were ever as because they used to say this in cycling as well, and I'm never sure if maybe people have just got older and they're starting to see it through those tinted spectacles.
Yeah,
and maybe they didn't party as much as they used to say. Or
I think I think people do. I think it was a bit more unrestricted back in the day, and there's more scrutiny on sport. So then, people need to behave themselves a bit more these days. But it's Formula One was very much a sport of excess, very kind of nouveau riche, in your face. Money is there. There's a huge amount of commercial side to it. A lot of superstars, a lot of Hollywood stars there in the paddock. It was a very showy sport, and quite in your face. Tennis, I would say, yes, is a fairly wealthy sport, and you compare it to others. But actually, it wasn't so commercial. It wasn't in your face. It wasn't. There wasn't this sort of entertainment meets sort of sport crossover. It was much more. I felt it was very much about tennis players who's kind of sacrificed their whole lives, who are totally dedicated on the cause at hand, which was to be the best players they could, and that was their lives. And it was less about the sort of money and all the stuff that goes on outside the sporting arena, much more about what goes on in the court, and perhaps the personalities are a bit less entertaining than maybe you see in F1. And I think that's because in F1 it's almost like drivers sort of become a parody of themselves. They think they've got to be entertaining and all about the glamour and stuff, so they play up to that. And in tennis, they're very focused. If you look at the players, to the extreme, when some would say, okay, they've become so professional. Again, I want to see those personalities come out. So there are differences. I'd just say, in a nutshell, F1 more excess, more flamboyant, and certainly than tennis, and that's how it was to work there.
So, how do you rate the health of both of those sports? Because I think tennis, from an outsider's point of view anyway, seems in quite a good place. You've got really good female role models. Yeah. The circuit's in a good place. There doesn't seem to be a sport that's struggling for money. You look at F1, there's always budget restraints, especially with the teams further back. People are criticising the sport for being quite boring and sanitised, I guess. Yeah. Jeremy Clarkson quite famously put out a video yesterday where he said, fuck Mercedes, fuck Ferrari, I'm done with all of them. Just make it entertaining again. As a person who's worked in both sports, do you agree with that assessment? And if so, what do you think Formula One needs to do to kind of get itself back in the mainstream, I guguess?
Yeah, I've got to mitigate my answer by giving my own background. I've never been a huge motor racing fan, petrol head. I've always been a tennis fan, so that's where I come into this from. But yes, when you've got someone like Jeremy Clarkson saying it's getting a bit boring, you've definitely got to look at it and ask some questions. And I think, yes, it has become a bit more sanitised. It's become a bit less interesting, and every sport is now going through this process where they're having to compete with other disciplines within their bracket, within motor racing. So you've got Formula E, that's a competitive sport. They've got other sports, and you've got to look at the changing, trends of what consumption habits and what young people want to do and how they want to engage in sports, if they want to engage in sports at all. So you've got all these trends to deal with. But you look at something like tennis, and I think they've done a pretty good job at not trying to stand still and thinking that we're not going to retain this audience forever. It's one thing to keep our current audience, another thing to gather a whole lot of millions of people under a certain age and bring them into our sport. And to do that, they're doing they've got things like the ATP Cup, which is a new sort of national team event they're bringing out in January. They're revamping the Davis Cup to make it more spectator friendly. They're looking at new ways of making the sport, constantly modernising the sport and making it more entertaining. And they're doing things with tie breaks. We saw in the Wimbledon final tie break, which they did get to, which is the new rule, a tie break at 12 on the 5th. Previously, it could have gone on and on and on. Some people would love that, but they've obviously taken that decision that, hang on, are we going to lose viewers at this point? So there are sports, I think, like tennis, they're constantly looking at themselves and thinking how are we moving with the times, and F1's having to do the same. But it's difficult times because audiences are fragmenting as well. People are losing attention quickly and they're going other places, whereas previously you could count for granted you get a certain number of fans.
So it'd be good to move on to talking about working with organising committees like Commonwealth Games Australia, working with WADA. So they're obviously significantly less glamorous, I guess, in comparison to...
It's a bit more serious.
A bit more serious, yeah. And the money's maybe a little bit more limited and you have to kind of make do with what you've got. So how did you find that transition working for an organising committee like Commonwealth Games, Gold Coast and things like that?
Yeah, big difference. I suppose... because I work for WADA, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, because I work for WADA, it didn't feel like a drastic change because it was a governing body mentality. Whereas if I'd gone from F1 to the Commonwealth Games, that would have been a bigger leap. But if you take the Commonwealth Games, it was a really interesting project. So I took that on because I thought, actually, the Commonwealth Games, there is a certain, from people in certain countries, Commonwealth countries, there is a certain affinity to the Games. Historically, it was very big. It was once almost as big as the Olympics. Those days are long gone. So to go into it from a communications and marketing point of view, and I'll try not to go too much into PR fluff here, but it was very much about, okay, how do you what's the identity of the Commonwealth Games? How are we going to make it stand out as something really big? And we've got a great market in Australia, people will tune in, but internationally, how are people going to tune in and not just think this is a much smaller Olympics? So it's all about how you kind of present it in a more accessible way, and just kind of, it was really trying to show that it's actually quite a progressive sports event. You've got sort of gender equality with referees, and we had I think it was 50% female referees in rugby sevens, things like this, which hadn't happened before, and then vice versa in netball, you'd have more male referees. So we're trying to do things which spoke of equality. We're trying to do things which spoke about the good side of the Commonwealth. We know its history, but it was also to talk about, okay, what does the Commonwealth mean today? And it's a pretty incredible product if you look at it like that, an eclectic group of countries, and you come together in a multi-sport event, and you've got David and Goliath, you've got giants and really small little island states who are competing against each other. You don't get that in Olympic Games. So from that perspective, it was actually being quite creative was the job there, and talk about the Commonwealth Games. The Games will go on regardless, but how do you talk about it and present it into something which is different than no other sports event? So a certain amount of it was serious governing body stuff and, ticking boxes and the regulations and all those kind of things. But a certain amount was actually trying to make it into quite a kind of, entertaining 2-3 weeks.
I guess the equality angle is where it's kind of built, because you also had the inclusion of para sports, which you don't get in the Olympic Games as well. And there's some really good stories come out of the small nations, because you had the guys from St. Helena who have to basically be on a boat to Cape Town for I think 3 weeks or something like that, and then they've got to fly from Cape Town all the way over to Australia and stuff like that. So there's some really interesting little anecdotes. But I think the disparity of how different countries buy into the Commonwealth Games is something that maybe people don't always appreciate in the UK. So I remember speaking to even like Canadian athletes, you can say Commonwealth Games, and it doesn't have a huge relevance. If you speak to British people, it's got, say, like a medium, it's definitely plays second fiddle to the Olympic Games.
Of course, yeah.
But then you speak to some Australians, and it's the biggest sporting event of the calendar, because it's a chance to beat the English.
Yeah, totally. It depends which country you're from as to how it's seen. And I believe with all of those, I think there was a part. I was in Australia during the Games. I wasn't back in the UK, but there was definitely a passing interest from people, that follow sport. And then for the big events like the England-Australia netball final, loads of people tuned in, and then he probably suddenly thought, oh, hang on, this is the Commonwealth Games. Yeah, I used to love this event. What's it about these days? So a lot of it was about, how relevant it is as a sports event. And again, something like the Commonwealth Games, it has a, huge challenge, but an exciting one for how it presents itself in comparison to not just the Olympics, but all the other sports events out there. But I think, different countries definitely see it different ways, and some of those smaller, islands and countries, to them it's, the absolute pinnacle of their careers, whereas to the bigger countries it's preparing for the Olympics. So yeah, it's all perspective.
And I guess not to put you on the spot here, but there was a slight controversy with the Commonwealth Games. It all gone pretty smoothly, but if everyone can remember, the closing ceremony got a lot of flack. Probably from me as well.
On Twitter, maybe.
On Twitter, yeah, I'd had a few drinks and I was in the crowd, and I was basically just like, what the hell is this?
Dangerous combination.
Yeah, never go on Twitter while you're drunk in a foreign time zone. Yeah, exactly. So how was that perceived from you guys being in the organising committee? Was it a bit of a kind of bitter taste after what was quite a successful Games to have it almost not tarnished, but not of the best ending with such a poor closing ceremony, I guess?
Yeah, I guess it was disappointing that it's at the end. So you've had a fantastic Games, and it really was a fantastic Games, and it came across so well, and so many people said how they really enjoyed the Commonwealth Games. It's disappointing that there was that sort of ending to it, where it didn't please everyone, and we all know how
didn't please.
How
who did it please? That's where I turn the screw
here
on this one. Yeah,
this is what you're known for.
Yeah.
No, it's it's one of those things, and actually, again, trying to look at the big picture. If there's other things that could have gone wrong instead, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. From the sporting side of things, it was very successful. People enjoyed it. There were some good stories coming out of it. The opening ceremony went well on the upside, so there's the PR side. Yeah, every negative,
50% of it went okay.
Yeah.
of the ceremonies.
Disappointing, but by and large the games were good. So I don't think there's anything to dwell on more than that. And
so I've been to 3 Commonwealth Games and Olympic Games, and like the World Championships always have opening and closings as well. And that's the only opening or closing ceremony I've ever been to. I won't be going to another one.
No, I mean, there's also an element of every opening and closing ceremony trying to outdo each other.
Yeah,
and it's like, well, where does it end? Especially
because
big countries that have the Olympics, and the fireworks bill is getting bigger and bigger.
Because Beijing went ridiculous. You had people rehearsing in nappies and stuff like that because they couldn't afford. You couldn't have a toilet break and stuff like that. And then London took this kind of cheerful element to it with people jumping on NHS beds and things like that.
I think it was, we can't outdo them from an extravagance point of view, but let's play on our sort of self-deprecation a bit more. Yeah. And people will quite like it, and I think some people did, and some were just scratching their heads.
No, I loved I actually occasionally still watch the London 2012 opening ceremony because that whole bit of like the Industrial Revolution and that change, that was amazing.
It was fantastic, and definitely from a British point of view, I think, overwhelming majority of people thought it was pretty fantastic.
Yeah, but everyone around the world was like, what's going on?
Scratching their heads. You look at the newspaper articles at the time, they're saying this is a very insular British opening ceremony, but they liked it.
Of your kind of most interesting jobs, I guess, was working for the World Anti-Doping Agency as head of media relations.
Correct.
You
got that right.
Got it right this time. And when you came into the World Anti-Doping Agency, that was just the beginning of the Lance Armstrong scandal. So that was a pretty tough task to take up as your first case, I guess.
Well, so when I came in, looking back specifically at that time, it was just at the tail end of the Armstrong sort of saga, if you like. It was about 3 or 4 months after the whole Oprah Winfrey interview, and so it'd been, I think, definitely as I came into it, cycling was the big thing, and that was the sport everyone talked about with doping problems. And as I came into it from a WADA perspective, WADA had a pretty public battle, I guess, with the likes of the UCI and others over how that whole era was handled. And that's when I came in, and I certainly think, having not been in anti-doping and then to go into anti-doping, you see it as sort of like, well, this is as big as it gets, and these are huge, huge problems, and these are big crises for sport. But of course, it went on to other crises, and they weren't in cycling, so it was only, it was the first of many.
And I guess to say it was a crisis for sport is actually true, though, because Lance Armstrong was bigger than just cycling. The guy who'd come back from cancer and all this kind of stuff, and the Live Strong bands and all that kind of thing, like so much good work, and always been kind of had this minor shadow of him of being a cheat, and some people believed it, some people didn't. But like, how big an impact do you think that had on the whole anti-doping landscape, I guess? Yeah,
it certainly has a big impact. I mean, from a anti-doping regulator point of view, whether you're a national agency or a global regulator like WADA, you go into all doping cases and all doping matters, and you do look at them objectively. You're taking out the celebrity, you're taking out all of that. But certainly from the outside point of view, obviously, the perception is that this isn't just another athlete that's done, been doping. This is someone of a certain stature and who's obviously been, perceived a certain way and lived their life a certain way, and had a huge fan base. So everything is amplified, and so the shock is greater.
So let's bring it up to today then, because now you're working for yourself.
Correct.
Ben Nichols Communications.co.uk.
Imagine the marketing meeting that led to that name. It was a tough one.
So that was quite a big transition for you, because you moved from, I guess, there's a lot of people who seem to move into sports governance and sports administration, never really leave. It can be seen as quite a comfortable place. So for you to take a leap and start your own business is quite a big step.
Yeah, no, I've always been one to take on new challenges and try and learn new things. And I think, I guess, starting up my own consultancy was the combination of my experience across the years and trying to say, right, I can do this myself and put all the bits that I've learned, and then add the new skill of setting up your own business, which is everything from the practical side of setting up a website, announcing it, pitching for new clients, proposals, having discussions with people. You're constantly having discussions with people because you're looking at growing your business. So all those skills which you haven't had to use, which you forget when you're employed by a company. We often complain when we're employed by a company, it's feels a bit stifling and restrictive, but actually there's a lot that's done for you that as a freelancer, your own agent, you've got to work out yourself. So you certainly, I guess, you learn things a lot quicker because the buck stops with you, and you don't have all these buffers to protect you for sort of corporate culture. So I've learned a lot, and I've got to work with a bigger variety of people, working with athletes, working with organisations. I'm working in the International Swimming League as well as the sort of sports governance and reform side. So it's been pretty varied. So it keeps me on my toes.
Are you able to talk a little bit more about the International Swimming League? Because to put that into context for the listeners, there was actually quite a public tussle for a little while, especially between Adam Peaty, who recently broke the world record yesterday.
Yeah.
Congratulations,
Adam. Yeah.
It was for your birthday.
Yes, I did have a chat to him.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
So can you talk about maybe what brought the International Swimming League to come about and try and explain that controversy for people and also what it might add to the sport?
Yeah, I've actually done a couple of sort of opinion pieces for what it's worth on the International Swimming League because I think it's it's almost symbolic of what many of us in sport, whether it's those working on the kind of athlete reform side, global athlete, whether it's the media following it, any of these kind of commentary subjects, I guess, the ISL is potentially, the absolute symbol of what's going to happen with sport in terms of Olympic sport, I should say, in terms of trying to modernise the way it becomes, more athlete-centred. It gives athletes more rights, whether it's their marketing rights, making greater personalities out of them, trying to help them really kind of showcase their sport and make it into a professional sport rather than, I guess, something that, the Olympic sport model in the past has been about things are done a certain way. It's quite protective. It's almost like a sort of public sector mentality. It's not a sort of entrepreneurial mindset. I think the ISL is kind of flipping that on its head and saying, actually, we need to make this a professional sport. We need fans to rally behind teams. We need to showcase these personalities and almost make swimmers into celebrities, which I think has huge potential. You look in Australia, and in many aspects, it's been a celebrity sport for a while, and that's quite rare. But then you've got this juxtaposition where when people do watch swimming in the rest of the world, a lot of people say, "Oh, we love this." So there's a massive gap there between and a huge unfulfilled potential. So I think the ISL has looked at that quite cleverly and thought swimming is a sport where we can really do this, and it's taken this franchise model of like the Indian Premier League cricket or pro leagues in the US, where it takes almost like a franchise team and gets the best talent out there and tries to grow a fan base around that. So I think it's onto something. Obviously, it's got its first meets this year in the States and in Europe, and it's got a lot of the top swimmers. It's got a lot of vocal swimmers who want to change their sport.
So we're going to wind up this podcast, and then next week we're going to actually talk a little bit about what I've been up to, because I realise that's quite a common question that comes in, and I'm always the one asking the questions and not necessarily answering them. So Ben's going to be taking the interview for that one, as Phil's still away. But yeah, so tune in next week. And Ben, if people want to follow you or find your website or anything like that, what's the shout outs for them?
Yeah, so you can find my website, bennichols.co.uk. Very easy to find. You can see what I do with my business, covering media relations, communications, content and writing for athletes, governing bodies, events. Find out more what I do there. Feel free to get in touch.
And from a personal point of view, I would say that Ben's done some work for me in the past, as well as I've worked with him quite closely on Global Athlete and things like that. So he really is at the top of his game. And if you need someone who's the epitome of professionalism, but also quite good at getting a bit of personality out of the athletes, he's a great guy to get on board. So definitely follow him and see what he's got to offer. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Callum. Cheers.